Morning. If you want to follow along, the first verse that we're going to read here is Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 15. Genesis 15, beginning 50, beginning verse 15. I should probably warn you in advance, the last time I preached this lesson, I had most of the congregation in tears. I did not plan the sermon at all to be that way. Please understand that. But you know, God, when He wrote the Bible, did not shy away from tragic stories that need to be taught for our better understanding. And in consideration of that, we should not be afraid to study such accounts for that matter. But in verse 15 of Genesis 50, we read, "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him.'" You can skip down to verse 19. "When the brothers meet together, Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones.' And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." You know, in the midst of living, we sometimes forget that God already knows the final outcome of our present circumstances, no matter how uncertain they are. I know it's not always easy to kind of look ahead and try to see things from God's perspective. We're honest, that is a very tricky thing to do. Certainly we're not God, but perhaps maybe to give you an idea of this, I'll give you a little example here. I have a DVD of the BCS championship in 2003 between Ohio State and the University of Miami. You know, it's really strange to watch that game because, now I'm not saying that I understand God because I watch an old football game. Please do not take that impression from it. No, I'm not saying that. But it's really weird. I mean, you know, the first quarter from a Buckeyes fan, there are some cringeworthy moments that happen in the first quarter, and there's a lot of close calls that happen in the fourth and in the first and second overtime. But I don't watch that with a lot of anxiety because no matter how uncomfortable things get, I know the Buckeyes are going to come out with the win. I know how it's going to end. Even as I'm watching, watching how no one in the game yet knows how it's going to happen. But we, of course, watching that from a past, we already know how it's going to happen. God being who He is, He's not affected by time like we are. He's never been outsmarted. Not even among the closest in Jesus' circle could slow down, much less stop God's plans from happening. I'm referring, of course, to Judas Iscariot, who carries a distinction among the 12 apostles. In artistic paintings of him, he tends to look similar to a lot of paintings of Jesus at first, but with a seemingly hardened expression. And perhaps this is done in a way to quietly express what Judas could have been, a friend to Jesus. Psalm 55, verse 12, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I can bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him. But it was you. A man my equal, my companion, and my acquaintance, we took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng." Some of you are probably familiar with the popular TV series The Chosen. Now, and I am not in any way trying to promote or advocate the show. I admit I don't watch it all that much. And I do think we need to be especially careful about making assumptions about things that aren't recorded in the scriptures. But I do appreciate Luke Dimian's approach, the actor, on playing Judas Iscariot. There's a clip where he talks about the real challenges of bringing out the realness in Judas Iscariot, because Judas does have one of the most notorious reputations in the Bible. And make no mistake, much of it is deserved. But by turning Judas into a caricature, into a two-dimensional villain destined for evil, as perhaps in an effort to distance ourselves from him, we are missing out on some invaluable lessons, even if they might make us feel a little uncomfortable. Now, we do not know a whole lot about Judas's background, but we should take a look at what the scriptures have talked about. First off, it's interesting because Judas is a name that is a form of Judah. And the Hebrew meaning of Judah is praised one. Judas specifically, as a form of Judah, means Jehovah leads. I think it's safe to say that his parents likely had hope for him to be led by God. Of course, for what he did, his name has a different meaning today. Try to take out what he did for just a moment. I know that's kind of difficult to do. It's almost like me telling you, don't think about elephants. Well, of course, the first thing you're going to think about is elephants. But for just a moment, try and take a look at the name Judas and try to remove what he did for just a moment. Just simply look at the name. It really isn't a bad sounding name at all. You know, it's similar to Jesus. It's a form of Judah here. Now, for a moment, let's just take a look at the names of the apostles: Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew. We have another James, Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas. Now, it should also be brought up, Thaddeus is also referred to as Judas. So Judas is not an unusual name at the time. It's interesting because even today, several of the names that we just mentioned here are often given to boys. And yes, I have met a Thaddeus. I have met a Bartholomew. But I have never met a Judas. Because, as you can imagine, today such a word is used to define betrayal. I mean, even in some crime shows today, sometimes it's said, he did a Judas. There's our Judas. You know, his legacy that he left behind is not a positive one. It didn't have to be that way. Now, where Judas came from, we're not specifically sure. We can make a pretty good guess. It is believed that he is from a town called Kerioth Hezron of Judea. Okay, you notice the R-I-O in the middle of that word. It's the same R-I-O that you see in Iscariot. Okay, yes, Iscariot is derived from the word Ish, which can also mean man of Kerioth. That is a small, humble farming town. Now, what's significant about that is that, you know, all the other apostles came from Galilee, and that's more northern Israel. So, if I understand right, some southern Israelites felt superior to northern during this time. Is it possible that Judas, from the beginning, felt a little more distant from the other 11? It's possible. We know that some of the others of the 11, some were brothers, some were friends, some were co-workers, all prior to meeting Jesus. And so, you know, Judas probably would have had a lower profile among the 12 initially. Now, there's no scripture that says that the other 11 deliberately left him out of occasions. There doesn't seem to be any indication of that. But perhaps being a little more distant from the other 11 led Judas to feel perhaps a little more tempted to betray them in the first place. Now, having said that, we should also take into account he was the treasurer of the group too. Whatever distance Judas felt from the other 11 obviously wasn't enough to the point that others were having suspicion about him. Being the treasurer, you don't obtain that role unless you've earned some trust among the others around you. Because, well, and something else to think about too, others of the 12 could have easily had the role of the treasurer. You've got Matthew the tax collector, for example, okay? On the other hand, Galileans were also considered to be second-class Jewish citizens. They would be recognized by their accents. Judas would have had an advantage here when interacting with people of a higher reputation. Judeans generally were viewed with a better esteem than Galileans. Of course, having a higher reputation and holding a higher position doesn't necessarily mean that one holds higher character. Indeed, it's safe to say that Judas probably followed Jesus for selfish reasons. Of course, we should take into account that many other people initially followed Jesus for selfish reasons, most of the apostles included. But in Luke chapter 18, we'll start in verse 29. This is just after the rich man walks away very sorrowful. Jesus said to them in verse 29, "Assuredly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or parents or brothers or wife or children for the sake of the kingdom of God, who shall not receive many times more in this present time and in the age to come eternal life." I guess for me, the key phrase there is for the sake of the kingdom of God. And I bring that up because we have to think about the works that we do for God. Are they really done for the purpose of serving Him? Or are we serving God thinking that we're going to get, something out, something special out of it? Are we trying to serve ourselves through these works? I think it's safe to say Judas was probably guilty of the latter here. Judas perhaps was a young patriotic Jew, and seeing this man indeed with these powers, he had probably hoped that Jesus would overthrow the Roman government and bring back a strong, wealthy kingdom once again. Could we perhaps be guilty of this, thinking that if we just keep on serving God, that He'll bring the so-called glory days back to our country? Again, keep in mind, he wasn't the only disciple who followed Him for such reasons. In fact, I recall a couple of instances in the gospel accounts where some of the apostles were arguing with each other over who would be the greatest. That wasn't Judas giving a one-man argument here. Now, that wasn't the case. You really don't have to look far among the 12 apostles to see they all had their quirks. They all had their flaws. And yet, over time, we see that these men, they leave behind their own ideas and simply follow Jesus wherever He led them. The rest of the apostles seem to catch on slowly that the true Messiah was not what they first expected, but they embraced the superior understanding of the biblical promises that Jesus unfolded to them. Ultimately, their love for Christ overcame their worldly ambitions. Judas probably never reached that point. In serving Jesus for 3 years, he'd perhaps become disillusioned. And I'm sure that he hid his disappointment pretty well. Probably because he was looking for a way to get some money out of the 3 years that he had invested with Jesus. Judas probably convinced himself that Jesus had stolen his life, robbed him of those years of money-making potential. And that sort of thinking ate away at him until he finally became the monster who betrayed Christ. Keep in mind, however, before we criticize Judas too much, even as Jesus picked him, knowing that it was going to be him who betrayed him, Jesus maintained his honesty. Jesus made it very clear in that verse that we just read in Luke that if followers were seeking him for fame and fortune, they were going to be pretty disappointed. If they were looking for that, it wasn't going to happen in this earthly life. And while this is all going on, Judas does stay with Jesus even when less devoted disciples left. I don't think it's going too far to say that Judas must have had some sincerity. I also think it's safe to say that he never really gave his whole heart to Jesus in the process. In John chapter 6, beginning in verse 66, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Then Jesus said to the 12, "Do you also want to go away?" But Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we come to believe and know that you are the Christ, Son of the living God." Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil?" He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. Now keep in mind, even though John wrote this, he did not know in those present moments of who it was going to be. He would have written this after the events had passed. Well, only Jesus knows, as we're about to see. But we'll also see that time and time again, Jesus warns about the consequences of the one who betrays him, and yet it wasn't enough. to motivate Judas to change. Judas just about reveals his true motives for serving Jesus in John chapter 12. John chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. And Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet with Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. For she has kept this day for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." Now, we should take into account this, how generous of an act this was. Okay? If this bottle of spikenard was worth 300 denarii, take the Sabbath days and the holidays off. You're talking this bottle's worth an entire year's worth of denarii. Now, I'm sure some of you husbands here have perhaps bought flowers, okay, for your wife, but I doubt you've spent an entire year's worth like that. This is a very generous act from Mary. Judas, of course, being who he is, criticizes her for it. Now, sadly, what we see is that in Matthew's account, the rest echo Judas's response. But the apostles, especially Judas, could not understand the flaws of their argument. They would not always have Jesus, and yet they were acting as if he wasn't worthy enough to have this bottle of fragrance used for him. Perhaps that might have been the last straw for Judas, because it is just after this account in Matthew 26, starting in verse 14, that one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he saw opportunity to betray him. There's no doubt he was greedy. And perhaps he was angry with Jesus for being rebuked, for serving him and not getting what he wanted. But then that just comes to show who Judas Iscariot was. You know, in consideration of all of this, this is actually a very gentle rebuke from Jesus, isn't it? It really is. I mean, Jesus could have humiliated him right there with much harsher words. Words that he said to Peter, for example. But we don't see him saying to Judas, "Get behind me, Satan." He didn't say that. I mean, he really could have called out Judas for his motives right there. Jesus would have known his heart, but he didn't do that. And yet, Judas apparently didn't want to own up to that mistake. Well, John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Yes, Jesus did one of the lowliest kinds of work, and he washed Judas's feet. You know, there's nothing like being humbled when someone that you don't think very highly of, out of nowhere, does a very unselfish act for you. Surely this act would have been enough to persuade Judas to reconsider what he's planning to do. And yet, Verse 6, then he came to Simon Peter. And Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. You know, we've talked about how Peter has a way of talking before he really thinks things through, but can we not for a moment appreciate how moved he is by this act of Jesus here? Judas, not so much, apparently. Verse 10, Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example. You should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, the servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, most assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And the disciples looked at one another, perplexed at whom he spoke. Now there was a leaning on Jesus' bosom of one of the disciples whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. And leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, Lord, who is it? Now us readers, we know exactly who it is. You know, once all the facts come to pass, it's really generally not that difficult to find the guilty party once that's all been laid out. I remember my junior year in high school, for about 2 weeks, some guy was repeatedly giving me prank phone calls, texting me about nothing in the middle of the night. Well, one day, I mentioned to my friends that someone had been harassing me. I was at the lunch table, and they asked for anything. And I didn't have much, but I did remember the last 4 digits of the phone number. And so I told him the digits, and I think it started with one friend who's now an instructor at Ohio State. But he turns his head, and one by one, the heads of the table start turning toward the one guy that never did seem to like me as much as the other people at the table. Well, all of us are scowling at him, and needless to say, the prank phone calls stopped right after that. But you've got to realize that wasn't the case here in this upper room. This wasn't one of those, Lord, who is it? There is no suspicion of Judas here. Judas really has played his part quite well. And you know, it honestly would be a little more humorous were it not for the many tragic events to follow. I mean, the person's right there in the room, but they really don't have any idea. And by the way, some of these men were very educated for their time. They weren't all fishermen. We've got Matthew, a tax collector. He would have had formal education for his time. James and John, they grew up with a priestly background, being the sons of Zebedee. You know, they would have had a similar upbringing. Yeah, there is no, who is it, Lord, while giving a suspicious look to Judas. There's none of that. Which apostle did they wonder about then? We got to keep in mind, they all had their quirks. If Judas wasn't the obvious choice, who would they have suspected? Well, what about Simon the Zealot, that revolutionary? You know, zealots were known for extreme opposition to Roman rule. they often engaged in violent rebellion. I mean, if anyone was going to turn on Jesus, the disciples might have thought it'd be Simon, frustrated that Jesus wasn't leading a military uprising. Maybe Simon would have felt that Jesus is being too passive, and he decides to join an armed rebellion. Maybe it's Peter. Peter has a history of acting before thinking, cutting off, an ear in the garden, challenging Jesus, making bold, if not reckless statements. I mean, if someone were to do something impulsive and harmful to Jesus, surely it would have been Peter. Well, what about Matthew the ex-tax collector? He had worked for Rome. He was a collaborator with the enemy. He had worked with the establishment. If anyone knew how to negotiate a deal with the authorities for personal gain, it was him. Then there's Thomas the skeptic. I mean, if he doubted Jesus later, maybe some disciples thought he's already wrestling with feelings of doubt. James and John, considered sons of thunder, they were kind of known for fiery tempers. Anyone was going to act rashly or betray Jesus in some ways, maybe it was them. I bring this all up because, as you can see, Judas has played his part very well. But Judas, of course, is not going to outsmart Jesus. Now, in verse 26, Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. And Jesus said to him, "What you do quickly." But no one at the table knew for what reason he said to them. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus said to him, "Buy those things we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. Now, if I understand right, and I could be wrong on this, the apostles probably all had their hand in the dish at some point, so they're all probably still wondering who it is. What we do know is that after Jesus says what he does to Judas, the rest still don't know what's about to happen. But what's interesting is that in the account of Matthew 26, Jesus gave a final warning to Judas. In verse 24, "The Son of Man indeed goes just as is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Time and time again, Jesus was warning Judas about the consequences. And yet, as it is, Matthew chapter 26, verse 44, "So he left them, went away again, prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.' And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, the great multitude with great swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer gave them a sign, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he's the one. Seize him.'" A few points to consider here. Judas knew Jesus well enough to know exactly where he'd be. The soldiers, meanwhile, wouldn't have been able to identify Jesus right away. It's dark, for one thing. There's no electric lighting, no cameras. It's not like they have some CIA profile and description of Jesus. And Jesus would have been dressed similar to the other disciples that were present with him. The multitude's goal is to get this man, and quickly, to avoid any onlookers or potential riots. And so, to understand Judas' significance in this betrayal here, verse 49, he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," kissed him. But Jesus said to him, "Friend, why have you come?" Friend is what really gets me there. Jesus had still been a friend to Judas. Judas had not been a friend to Jesus. It's only after Jesus is led away to be crucified that Judas understands the reality of what he's done. And then, as we read that Judas, his betrayer, Matthew chapter 27, verses 3 through 10, Judas' betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I've sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, What is that to us? You see to it. And he threw down the piece of silver in the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they were the price of blood. And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. The chief priests and elders had just condemned an innocent man and arranged for his death in a parade of unrighteous travesties, and yet their piety would not allow them to mingle this blood money with the rest of the money in the temple treasury. Apparently, they'd just forgotten that it was they who had paid the blood money to Judas in the first place. In keeping the price of blood out of the temple treasury, they'd carefully strained out the gnat, but only after having swallowed the camel, to use an analogy. And we likewise need to be careful that we're not swallowing camels in our daily lives while ostentatiously straining out gnats to impress our religious neighbors here. Just a little side note there. Yes, Judas, feeling remorse, hangs himself, seeing what he's done, and yet, as far as we understand, never repents of what he did. That's quite a difference between Peter, who repents and lives for Jesus for the rest of his life. And yes, the rest of the apostles will be heavily persecuted. Nearly all of them are going to die a martyr's death for their beliefs. And yet they leave behind a much better legacy, examples to follow, and as far as we understand, they're in a much better place. If only we could have the same hope for Judas Iscariot, a man who interacted with Jesus in the flesh, and yet made the wrong choices and never repented for it. And you know what's so tragic about all of that is that Jesus would have forgiven him. Can you imagine for just a moment, in a alternate timeline, the scene of Jesus assuring Thomas that he's alive, and then next to him is Judas Iscariot, who can't even look at him, ashamed of what he's done. Imagine Jesus telling him that he still loves him, that he forgives him. And yes, Judas would have likely have died a martyr's death, but imagine the positive impact from this. Another fine example of forgiveness. And through that, Judas could have continued showing the world from his own experience of what God's love is. Maybe he could have written one of the 66 books in the Bible, and maybe some men among us would be proudly sharing his name. But we know what happened. And I believe that as Jesus is being tortured physically and psychologically, one of the many things that's affecting him is knowing that there's no hope for Judas, a man he had loved, a man he had interacted with for 3 years. And yes, Judas did pick him knowing it would be him who betrayed him. But understand, Jesus warned him time and time again of the consequences of betrayal. Judas would have heard all that, and he would have probably heard all those parables in person. You know, those stories are aimed at us, yes, but, you know, Judas heard them too. Prophecy did indicate a traitor, but no prophecy said who it specifically would be. There is no indication that Judas was forced to be the one who betrayed Jesus. No, it was Judas who qualified his own self for that role. So, lessons for us to think about as we wind this down. 1, God will warn, but he's not going to stop you from sinning. I mean, Jesus washed Judas's feet, gave every warning possible. At the end of the day, though, God has given us individual free will. We decide by our own decisions whether or not we will serve him. You can't just expect to keep on living a sinful lifestyle and hoping that God's going to bring some magical sign for you to get all the motivation you need to get your act back together. It's just not how it works. Also take with some encouragement that no evil act can thwart God. You know, there's too many Christians that live in fear. You know, even if heavy persecution should come our way, frankly, I would argue that's a big if. No act can thwart God. If Satan can't do it, neither can man. course, also realizing that betrayal like this isn't a sudden action, there is kind of this temptation to say that Judas was a good man who had a really, really bad day. He was a man who made some bad decisions, and his deeds finally became known. Watch and see if you're stumbling. I mean, really self-examine yourself, because these kinds of things are the steps that lead to becoming Judas, not like Jesus. You must not have the wrong motives. Serving God in a hope to get fortune and fame are the wrong motives. Look, hell should scare you. You should want to see heaven. God knows that you have needs. He's made it clear that He will provide for you. But is that all that you're living for? Finally, don't waste your opportunities. You know, to Judas, serving Jesus must have felt like a wasted opportunity. Perhaps that's why he hated him to the point of betraying him. What little did he understand? And so, in consideration of that, question for all of us is, who are we more like? Jesus or Judas? Just something to think about. This is the time that, we offer the invitation to anyone who needs it. It is tragic knowing that it is too late for Judas. But if you're here this morning, maybe you've stumbled into sin, it's not too late for you. We give you the opportunity to obey God's plan of salvation. Do you need the prayers of the congregation? Is there something that you're genuinely struggling with? Let us help you in whatever way that we can. If you're subject, won't you come forward?